Hello, I'm Ursula, and I'm trying to make sure that I set up us right here. And I think we're good to go. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Okie dokie. Coding is in the bag. This is something that evolved over the last 6 months out of some other things. It's a different approach to learning to code, and I'm only going to show you one piece of code, and it's very old code or very new code. So what's in my bag? This is lessons learned from coding and textile crafting, both of which I've been doing for way longer than some of you have been on this planet. It's a very different approach to coding expertise. I'm going to talk about the ancient tradition of craft instruction and how computer science could benefit from that. What's very important to my conversation here is to pick your own path, define your own agenda. Physical skills require developing muscle memory. And what we don't talk about a lot in computer science anymore, we used to call it problem solving, is cognitive skills require developing mental muscle memory. What's also important is that engagement occurs when you make something you want to make. And confidence and competence are mutually supportive, which is why most classrooms are not really good places to learn to code. And finally, my disclaimer here is that I moved yesterday and my house is being sold tomorrow. And I'm overwhelmed. So the first claim is that coding did not, and computer science did not get invented in the 20th century. Coding is ancient. And I'm going to talk about this from a couple of different perspectives. I've been running a code crafter curriculum for a while, and the assertion there is that textile artists developed the great ideas of computing and coding millennia ago. I've been having a lot of fun telling people there's nothing new in computer science. This came out of a course at Grinnell where we played with collaborative quilt making, both in using crocheting and using turtle stitch to create a more traditional quilt. But it also grew out of Mount Anthony High School student program for students at risk. And students at risk are those who are not expected to make it through high school. Danny and Rick Crozier ran that program for 15 years. All of their students graduated from high school, and the vast majority of them went on to community and four-year colleges. At Mount Anthony, Anne Marie Weber, who is also part of our SIGGRAPH team on Turtle Stitch, created a math curriculum for basic skills math, which involved a final exam where each student had to put together a turtle stitch rendering for a collaborative quilt. Coding is ancient. My new friend is Rebecca McNamara, who is the associate curator of the Tang Education Museum at Skidmore. And she put out an incredible installation called Radical Fiber. The book is going to be available fairly soon. And the conversation she and I have been having is about how fiber artists do something akin to, but more complex than computer programmers. And again, this is controversial in this environment, but the artists get it. The other thing that we've been talking about a lot, and which was a huge part of Radical Fiber, was this idea that design is naturally iterative, but not linear. And it involves recovery, not necessarily debugging at all steps. The most practical reason for shifting gears is that the turtle community and a little group called Coding and Stitches, the Stitchers are represented here. You know one of them. I think you know Elaine as well. What Cynthia, Elaine, and Beth did was they corrupted my curriculum. I was out to teach them about how to program in Java, and they all went in their own directions. And Phil Jemmett nailed it with his issues with teaching programming. I co-opted his slide. and Margaret's. And in particular, this idea that there is a direct route from A to B, which is what we do in classes, okay? We give them some concept and we give them an assignment and they've got to do it our way. And if we don't do it the way we expected the solution to come out, then the automatic grader doesn't grade them well. Well, coding is ancient, and here's codings in a bag. You can learn to code by learning a textile art with support from computational tools. That's the assertion. There are apps like Hatch, which is this gigantic $1,000 piece of software to do embroidery. And it has an incredibly steep learning curve, and you essentially buy products and adapt them. There are data repositories. Shimaseki makes these awesome embroidery machines. But their resources are very expensive. There are lots of online resource centers, and they can be wonderful. Spruce is my favorite, but they're hard to find, and they are really focused on crafting. And then finally, there are coding tools, and we know about those. Okay. So I want to step back for just a second, and I'd like you to think about your own answers to this. And if you want to throw them in the chat, go ahead. I can't read the chat and talk at the same time. I can barely use video screens and talk at the same time. Is coding hard? Can anyone learn to code? What preparation is required? Are coding communities inclusive? Is coding a craft? Do we agree on what's important? And something came out of the SIGC listserv that some of you may be part of a couple of days ago by Mark Lewis, where he's hoping to try to understand what are the big concepts. And what struck me about this is, yeah, I kind of agreed, but I couldn't figure out what in the world he meant by print versus return. And while walking the dog a couple of days later in the woods, I went, yeah, he's talking about commands, reporters, and predicates, except he's stuck in one language culture, and I live in a couple of others. And so even amongst ourselves, we don't speak the same language. We don't share the basics. What I also want to mention here is something that's very important to me, is this notion of accessibility and who can learn to code. And the analogy for me is women's tennis. Okay, back in the 70s, Billie Jean King was my hero. I was a very bad tennis player. Okay, and it was a big deal that she was the first athlete to win over $100,000 in a single session. Okay, and then we have Serena Williams, regarded as one of the greatest tennis players of all time. A lot of what happens in the way we teach coding and computer science is dependent upon our attitudes about who can teach it and what is the supportive culture around what we're going to do. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about mental muscle memory. Okay. It really means do it again and again and again and again and again and again. And yes, you can go write me a recursive little thing in Snap to print that out. And the big influences for me on this notion of mental muscle memory, first of all, come from my good friend, the composer Tom Parente, who's written a book called The Positive Pianist, about how when you practice, you have to be in the flow. The other one that is very bittersweet is Arlene Marin is one of my best friends in Montclair, New Jersey, where I don't live anymore as of 2 days ago. And she's a master crafter and retired programmer. And we've had long conversations. And it boils down to this. I got a recording a few days ago. Coding is not about knowing how to express an algorithm in a language. It's about how to move back and forth through a problem. And what's interesting is Arlene can't do that in code anymore. She used to code in BASIC all over the world, installing business systems. But she can do it in quilting. And we have had the great pleasure of quilting together for a decade. And I have learned volumes from her. Okay. Back to Rebecca McNamara, my new friend. Textile workers are not unskilled. They spend as much time recovering from unanticipated events as designers do, imagining and composing that thing. Okay. And then finally, I didn't include a slide. For the last couple of years during COVID, I was part of, I consulted for a textile automation startup company. And I was working on two projects, one in high-end embroidery, one on machine knitting. And I was told at one point, even though we were filing patents on it, we received a couple patents on the processes, that we were closing down the project because embroidery cannot be fully automated because thread breaks. Not to mention the other 30 pain points that I identified that were just too hard to automate. So what is it that I'm after here? I'm after a repository for my friend Danny Crozier, who is waiting with bated breath on a final appointment to a job, again, working with, shall we call them, problematic children. In a different age, it might have been working in what's called a reform school. And they need an offline computer-based network of activities for interdisciplinary projects, such as upcycling. You all know what upcycling it is. It takes those bags that we all use that can't be recycled and end up in the trash and turns them into useful products. The bag in the big picture was built in, was created in Africa and sold as a fundraiser. The little bag was done by one of Danny's students in a previous class. And by the way, the reason she ended up with it is that after he finished it, he didn't like it because the button wasn't centered. And so he made a better one for himself because in the instruction set, no one had told him to make sure that he had the button centered. Okay. So this repository that I'm inviting you all to join me in is that we want to use fiber arts to build mental muscle memory for problem solving, for general problem solving. These are kids who don't get an opportunity to do that except in destructive ways. We want practical opportunities for web development and coding. Danny's vision is for the kids to contribute to the repository and to create their own repository. And it has to be offline because if you let them loose on the internet, stuff happens. Okay. Happens in high-end elite classrooms as well, but this is a different problem. Okay. We also want multiple pathways, simple to complex activities, and Arlene and I call this the Francesca problem. Another grandmother friend of ours has a new grandchild, wanted to build a quilt for the first time, had a book, wanted to know which quilt to choose. And Arlene knew immediately which one was going to be most successful given the fabric that Francesca had already bought and the complexity of the quilts in the book. Okay. The idea is that in this network of activities, the lessons are nodes that not only point forward to what may follow, how to elaborate, or back, what prerequisites there are, but sideways where you have choices between how to go forward. Okay. And so the many alternative paths to reach, there are many alternative paths to reach multidisciplinary learning goals. And an unbrave teacher might consider having all of their students go through one path together. But if they're a chaos insider the way I am, they might have students going in different directions. And I actually have some evidence that that happens anyway, is that kids just say, I'm not going to use turtle stitch. I want to do this by hand. I don't want to have to crochet. I just want to do turtle stitch and so on. Okay. I want to remind you that textile patterns, the things that we pull off the web, that we buy in books, that we used to get in patterns, okay, those are algorithms, and they have variables, and they have repetition, and they have selection. It's all there, okay? And the idea of recovery that Rebecca and I are exploring is debugging on steroids. It's not simply that, oops, something went wrong, I have to fix it, but it's learning how to anticipate what might happen, or being able to say, wait, that just doesn't work. The best plan, it just doesn't work. I want to fix this, or I want to change it, or I've thought about it differently. And the other thing that Arlene and I are both very confident about is when The crazy quilters in Montclair get together, and in my 60s, I am the youngest one by almost a decade. We do a lot of direct interaction, and it is not rude. It is very polite, but it's very direct. And having somebody say, Mariette, your stitch isn't straight. Try it again. Happens all the time. It is the penultimate kind of collaborative software engineering we all wish we could teach our students. Okay, so why bags? Okay, they vary. Remember that word vary, right? That's one of the big ones. They vary in size, shape, and use. Okay, lots of things are technically bags. You can see some here. There's an old skirt of mine that I made when I was 15. Hats. There's a real bag that my friend Tanya Dixon made in the middle there. Okay, that's kind of the ultimate. There are pot holders and pillows and placemats. They're all P words. I just noticed. And they are bags that you sew up completely. They're known as pillowcases. Okay, they inspire creating something beautiful, personal, and practical. So they're extraordinarily motivating. Right? They can be given as presents. About half of the ones here are presents. And there are a couple of them that have been sold as fundraisers. Okay. So here's my one piece of code. To generalized bag, given a size, okay, we have a whole bunch of sub-procedures or whatever you want to call them. You'll have all kinds of language for them. You pick or make exterior fabric. The things in italics are optional. Okay, we can embellish the exterior. In this case, in this bag, I've actually created a piece of patchwork and then used that as my fabric. Okay, you pick a lining. I like white because I can see into it. You add pockets that may be zippered. Okay, you need to do that before you put the bag together. It's a lot easier. Okay, you cut the two pieces, the lining and the outside, to the same size. You might put an optional closure on it. And if it's Velcro, the cheap trick, notice that the top of the bag doesn't show the Velcro outline on it. If you put that on the liner, then it's hidden. Okay, you sew a pillow, and then you flip the pillow inside out so your wobbly seams don't show. Okay. And you close the opening, and you can do that by hand, which many of my friends like. I tend to just sew it on the machine and then hide where that is, like underneath that flap. If you're sufficiently skilled, you top stitch. And what you can see on this one is I did, but I didn't do a really good job, but that's okay. I love the bag anyway. Okay. Then you fold this out and sew the edges of the bag. You pick a strap and attach fabric. Okay, and you get experience in design and implementing algorithms with variables. You can combine things to make beautiful, useful, creative things. With fibers and needle, you can piece, you can embellish, you can make fabric, or this is just the start. Okay, Elaine Wolf is incredible with paper. Okay. Now, it's not just computing in support of crafting, having tools that help you do this, but it's crafting in support of computing. It is on the left, there's the classic friendship block, and on the right is a visualization that I shared with a women's group during COVID when we couldn't get together. I took the idea from crafting and created something in a little system we're calling quilt blocks. This one happens to be in P5. So come play with me. I need help. We need to put this together. And if you want to play, email me at riversoundsoul@gmail.com, and my developer will connect you with the system that we thought we would launch by today, but I decided to move instead. Thank you.